Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Braverman.
And I'm Ellen Selm,
Welcome to our podcast, Stories from the Earth,
where we explore humankind's relationship and connection with the natural world.
Okay, so I'd like everyone to take out your phones or whatever devices you're watching or listening this podcast on. This will only take a minute. So if you have not already, please scroll down to the podcast descriptions and find the links. And find your favorite social media platform and give us a quick follow. We really appreciate that. That really helps support the show. And also, if you love what you hear, you love listening to our podcast, and you have an extra $1, $5, or $10 a month, we do have a Patreon page, and the link is in the description as well. And one other thing, we would love to hear from you guys. If you have questions or comments, podcast topics, our email is storiesfromtheearth@gmail.com.
Today we are going to be talking with Marc Williams. He's an ethnobiologist based here in Western North Carolina, originally hailing from Florida. He has studied the people, plant, mushroom, microbe connections intensively while learning to employ botanicals and other life forms for food, medicine, and beauty. His training includes a bachelor's degree in environmental studies, concentrating in sustainable agriculture with a minor in business from Warren Wilson College, and a master's degree in Appalachian Studies concentrating in sustainable development with a minor in geography and planning from Appalachian State University. He has traveled through 30 countries in Central, North, South America, and Europe, and in all 50 of the United States. He's visited over 200 botanical gardens and research institutions during this process while taking tens of thousands of pictures of representative plants and other living entities. He also is the primary facilitator of the website plantsandhealers.org and on the board of directors for the United Plant Savers. Marc has taught hundreds of classes to thousands of people about the marvelous world of humans and their interface with other organisms, while working with over 70 organizations in the last few years and online maintaining botanyeveryday.com. His greatest hope is that this effort may help improve our current global ecological challenges. How have we not had this gentleman on our show sooner? I do not know. So, Marc, can you tell us a little about yourself and describe how you got interested in plants and herbalism? Like, what sparked the interest? How did you become an ethnobiologist?
Certainly. But first and foremost, just want to thank you so much for having me and all the good work you do in this space. And also realize I need to edit my bio a little bit on the website because I cycled off the board of United Plant Savers. I was on there for 3 years and I do still work with them a lot, but I'm not currently on the board of directors, maybe more the board of advisors and a consultant. But as far as what got me to that place, it was kind of a long, arduous journey that I've discussed a lot in the online space. So maybe I'll try it because it can, be long. Just try to be succinct in that I really wasn't raised this way. I was raised to be an officer in the military. I definitely had a certain affinity for plants that really wasn't nourished as a child. After leaving basically ROTC training from my first year of college, then I kind of was at a loss for what to do. And one thing that I knew that I'd love to do, have loved since I was a child, was make food. And so I started working in a number of places that were like restaurants. I mean, initially more like fast food, to be honest, but I ended up at a restaurant called Our Place Cafe in Gainesville, Florida in the late 90s. And that coupled with doing my first Vipassana meditation, which is a tradition that happens all over the world by donation, 10-day silent meditation retreats. I did my first one in 98. In the middle of that meditation, I got this insight that I really needed to understand where the food that I was cooking came from. And so luckily the place I was at, Our Place Cafe in Gainesville, was doing the local food farm to table thing before that was really so common in the modern age. And so I started working on the farm that supplied that restaurant, Phoenix Rising Farm, north of Gainesville. And in that process, one of my coworkers, a person named Laura, started showing me some of the wild plants and connecting basically this thing that went back also to my childhood of loving things like Dungeons and Dragons and Tolkien and the Hobbits. And I always was really somebody that resonated with the elves and the nature spirits and that kind of thing, but always thought of it in the frame of make-believe. And so then all of a sudden it's like, wait, this is real? Like people make potions still, or even. So that kind of set me on this journey. And right in that frame too, I found out about the concept of permaculture, which is another worldwide thing happening to try to, supply our societies in a sustainable way with our needs. Yeah, that was all in Florida, but then kind of launched me in this whole different direction. I did get my associate degree in Gainesville at Santa Fe Community College that was in kind of greenhouse production and some plant stuff. But then shortly after that, moved to the Asheville area in '99 and started working on an organic farm there, and really just in earnest, reading and learning from local people and everything, more initially about food production, but then shortly kind of also putting in, because I had this little bit of a market garden for the restaurants I worked with there, like the Blue Squirrel Cafe and City Lights Cafe, which is still in Silva to this day. So a little bit outside the Asheville area, about an hour. But anyway, I started growing flowers for them. I was like, wow, you can make as much money or more with flowers than food. How weird is this? So that led me to Warren Wilson College to do a degree in sustainable agriculture and basically take all of the plant classes that I could. Yeah, I still didn't know about ethnobiology, or probably barely somewhat ethnobotany at that point. It probably is bearing the lead to like have a technical term like that might not be known by your audience in full. So basically you're kind of combining two sciences, right? Mm-hmm. And I think ethnobotany is the most famous version, but ethnology is the study of various different human cultures and people and places and their interactions. And then, botany, for instance, is study of plants, but is of course a subset of the science of biology, which is the study of all life. And so to get to ethnobiology, which is this bigger umbrella, you have ethnomycology, the connection between people and mushrooms, ethnobornithology, the connection between people and birds, and ethnomicrobiology in theory, although I've never heard that term. Maybe I just coined it. But basically, any way that people interact with other life forms is the purview of ethnobiology. And I became pretty obsessed with that in the early 2000s and have continued to study that basically to this day, and largely within this frame of sustainability and how this knowledge can help us to be more sustainable in our societies moving forward into the future.
Keeping the human nature connection relevant to everybody's everyday life and so forth.
Right. And I guess framing it in that way, I was just watching a little video, as one does in this day and age, from an indigenous activist from Ecuador in South America. Unfortunately, the name doesn't come to me right now, but the point being this kind of frame within many indigenous traditions all over the world of no separation between humans and nature, right? Like humans are nature. And in fact, like one tiny little aspect of it, along with all the birds and the microbes and the insects and all these other things. And I feel like that's actually, if not a fatal flaw, certainly one that, well, it is currently a fatal flaw, but hopefully one we can overcome, of this basic separation between humans and nature, and then also this framing of humans as dominant and over nature even more so. In my estimation, that is clearly like something that we need to reevaluate for our future prosperity.
So what was the first plant you felt really connected to, and why?
Yeah, well, I have to have two because I'm not sure which one came first, or right around the same time. So basically, when I was a very young child, I was living in Alabama, where my dad is from. And I remember kind of simultaneously, say like probably 6 years old or so, discovering honeysuckle and being able to pull what I didn't know was the stigma of the honeysuckle out the back of the flower and get this little drop of honey that would like literally keep me busy for hours, like searching out those flowers and just doing this little. And then I can remember my dad growing roses in the house that we lived in at that time, and how much he loved those roses and took care of them and would harvest them to like bring to people for special occasions. And then also the pine tree that was outside that same house in the front yard that, had pine beetles, I remember, or also cicadas coming out around that time. And then there were tulips at the base of that pine tree. So I know I said 2, but gosh, I'm obsessed with thousands of plants. So that's 4. I'm also half Dutch, so calling in the tulips makes sense as well.
It's a little bit of a dangerous question asking an herbalist what their favorite or to name any one plant, but
I appreciate you providing the questions though too, because at least then it allows for, not an on the spot trying to like go through. It's like picking your favorite children, I imagine, or something, or anything that you have a whole bunch of favorites of.
And I think sometimes people think like they have to come up with maybe an answer that's like, oh, because, this one was a medicine and it saved my life, which is completely a valid answer. But like, it's nice too to hear the simple, like, no, there was this relationship because I saw my father's loving care and tending the roses, and that left a distinct impression, like to open people's minds up to the ways that plants kind of infiltrate our lives in ways that you might otherwise overlook. So that's really beautiful.
Thank you.
What was your favorite part of your education that helped you get on the path that you're like with what you're doing now, would you say?
Probably right at the beginning are the rainbow gatherings, which is actually something I wrote a whole paper on when I was in community college back in the 90s. But short of the long of it, these are gatherings that happen all over the world, everything from regional, and the first ones I went to are around Valentine's Day in South Florida, or in Central Florida in Ocala. Actually, it's the 30-year anniversary. Yeah, it was 1995. I went to my first one. And it's this total kind of open, somewhat anarchic thing where people gather together out in national forests as the unifying principle to basically co-create community for a certain amount of time, often a few weeks or so. And that's really getting me more into things like plant walks, just this kind of more organic way of being on the ground in the earth, and camping and fire circles and all those things. And welcomehome.org, I guess I would close saying that's probably one of the best online resources to look into rainbow, if that sounds intriguing. But beyond that, definitely academia did me right. I went more as an untraditional later age student. When I went to get my bachelor's, I was in my late 20s at Warren Wilson College, and I was like primed and ready. And I literally put my shoulder to the wheel as hard as I could for the 2.5 years that I was there to do everything I could do to improve my education. And they really facilitated that to an unbelievable level that I will be forever grateful. So go Owls. And beyond that, Appalachian State University, where I got my master's degree, very similar, although I was in my mid-30s at that point, and but just literally spent thousands of hours of my life studying particularly the plants of Appalachia and how we can interact with them sustainably. And once again, they facilitated that. The whole top floor of their incredible library complex is just on Appalachia, thousands of books on Appalachia. So that was just, once again, chef's kiss of education. But to say, just as much so like Rainbow, another one and more recent, I would say that's more informal and certainly a lot less expensive, is the Earth Skills gatherings. And locally in the Nashville area, we have the Firefly Gathering, which is well over a decade old now. But there's one in Florida, there's one in the Piedmont, there's the original one, River Cane Rendezvous and Falling Leaves in Georgia, but they happen all over the country. There's actually a map of them as well at earthskillsgatherings.org, I think. These are places where you might spend a few $100s for the experience, but then you could have 100, even a few hundred classes available to be able to learn from. And there's certainly always work trade, and often there's scholarships too. So it's often something that if money is a limiting factor, you can work around that. So I've super, super duper appreciated those. I didn't mention Rainbow, there is no money. So as far as like barriers, I mean, you can donate money to the collective good around food supplies, but as far as like the plant walks and any classes that happen at Rainbow are totally volunteer, basically. That's another thing that I've loved about that. And it also got me going all around the country. That's how largely I went to all 50 states is, going to the Washington Rainbow or the Wyoming Rainbow or the Utah Rainbow or the California Rainbow or the Arkansas Rainbow or the Vermont Rainbow, Pennsylvania Rainbow, West Virginia Rainbow.
Do you find yourself now, I would assume, more on the other side where when you were first going, you were partaking and now more you go and you teach?
Well, that's an interesting question because for one, I've kind of cycled out of Rainbow for various reasons that are probably too complicated to unpack here, but so I don't really go anymore. But at the end, which I think literally the last time I went was quite a while ago, Georgia 2019, it was to teach, but there is always more to learn, I guess, short the long of it. And definitely one of my greatest teachers of all time, which I guess I'm kind of segueing and presaging the next question, is Seven Song, who has done plant walks at Rainbow for many decades. He's the teacher of many of my teachers. And we've co-taught for years at Rainbow together. He's probably taught me about as much about botany as anybody other than maybe like my college professors for my undergrad.
Well, yeah, I guess, Jennifer, that does segue into your question.
Well, I just first wanted to add that all these links that Marc is putting out there, I'm going to put them in the description of the podcast, so you'll be able to check anything out that you're interested in. All those sound really amazing. I had no idea Rainbow was free. It's funny because I graduated high school in '96, so I just sort of remember mention of it just in the passing by, but I never went. I love that it's free because money is definitely one of the barriers that I have found in my life to herbal education. Don't think I'm alone in that. Even going to college, like once I found out that there was this thing called ethnobotany, I'm like, I want to go to school in that. It was too late to figure this stuff out, and it's too expensive to go, and I have to work. So anyway, yeah, that's really cool. On your journey, was there an herbalist, botanist, biologist who really inspired and supported you along your path? Did you have anyone you would consider a mentor?
As you might imagine, that's another one that's just like, oh my God, where do I begin? But I did try to kind of narrow it down some. And there's definitely, I would say, a top one who's a person named Frank Cook. I mean, so much so that both my website, botanyeveryday.com, is in his lineage, and then also a separate website, plantandhealers.org, is a nonprofit that I used to direct. It's not an ongoing nonprofit. It's been unwound, but it was for like about a decade, this nonprofit established, and the website will continue on and the social media to continue Frank's lineage. So Frank is somebody who traveled all over the world, learned from the plant people along his way, and then wrote up his experiences in various different manners. And then also went to Rainbow every year and was co-leading the plant walks initially when I went with Seven Song. And so I was a student at that point, in the audience of often plant walks of 50 to 80 people, huge plant walks. And so, yeah, without a doubt, Frank, kind of my big brother, mentor, inspiration. And then one of his greatest teachers, Jim Duke, Dr. Jim Duke, who has published numerous books. I kind of think of him as my intellectual grandpa in a way, because I didn't get to meet him till kind of later in life. Luckily, he got into his 80s. In particular, wrote The Green Pharmacy, and when he retired from decades with the USDA, established that book, The Green Pharmacy, incarnate in botanical garden form, which is basically a botanical garden that has over 100 beds, each bed focused on a particular ailment. And within each one of those beds, the plants that are best for that ailment from his decades of research. World-class library. It's north of Washington, D.C., about half an hour at Fulton, Maryland. And it does continue on. He's passed now. Yeah, it's an ongoing concern. If people are ever near D.C., I highly recommend going to check that out. Actually, my first teacher, so I'm sorry, I kind of buried the lead. I probably should have said before I even knew Frank Cook existed, even though we were probably hanging out in those Ocala rainbow gatherings, is Juliet Blankespoor. I mean, definitely in the mid to late 90s, she was already an incredible plant person, went to the University of Florida for botany, and definitely some of my earliest plant medicine making and plant identifying was with Juliet in the 90s, and she continues to be one of my greatest inspirations to this day. Of course, she runs the Chestnut School of Herbal Medicine as well, which I've been a contributor to over time. Got to shout out Amy Boyd in particular, who is my botany professor at Warren Wilson College. Definitely the hardest class I've ever taken in my whole entire life in such a good way. Beyond that, I would say mycologically wise, since we're kind of encompassing ethnobiology, not just ethnobotany or herbalism, Ken Krause, by far the best and most impactful in my life. He lives kind of north of Asheville and Boone. After that, Alan Muscat, who runs business called No Taste Like Home, where he brings people from all over the country out in the woods to learn about foraging, and I worked for him for a number of years in that regard. Mateo Rial is kind of like a peer of mine. It was interesting when Frank Cook passed, it was almost like there were all these acolytes. Like there was literally Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul. It was like really kind of wild. And Mateo in particular, as far as mushrooms, he goes by Mateo Matthew, right? And then I would say as far as the next generation, Eric Joseph Lewis is an incredible inspiration. In so many ways of kind of walking the walk and talking the talk, both with plants and fungi and sustainable living in general.
Been very fortunate to have quite the roster of connections. That's amazing.
I mean, such a small subset. I kind of feel bad, I kind of wanted to do a whole big laundry list of people, but there's no way I could pick just one, but if I had to pick the most impactful folks, and I'm probably still missing people for sure. Michael Stevens, I would actually put out there as far as both mushrooms and plants. Speaking of, he's on my paper there, but yeah, I have been very lucky and I'm very grateful. And of course, our area of Western North Carolina is a huge hotbed for this stuff. And that's why I fell in love with it as well. So somewhat both by providence and by design.
I'm curious, do you feel, because you've been involved in such scenes across several states for a while now and met some of these amazing people even before some of them have passed, do you feel that what you're observing is that there's a lot of people still out there that are like filling these voids that these big souls are leaving? From my perspective, it seems like for as much as like TikTok and whatever else has made certain elements of plants and witchery and folklorism and everything kind of trendy, there's sometimes a surface level to it.
Exactly.
Like, are there people going deeper, filling the? I mean, I would argue certainly you are one of the people that is helping fill.
Thanks, but I'm old, so like I'm talking, about young people. I mean, I'll give people their flowers. I mean, Alexis Nicole Nelson is like mind-bendingly amazing. There's a guy who goes by the Wild Dryad, actually. He's incredible. There's Adam Harrington. I mean, there's certainly some young people, but I guess my point is I wish there was way more. Like, I mean, every community needs like a guild of these kind of people, that's specific to their bioregion and their needs. And I'm definitely not seeing that. I think there are certain hotbeds for this kind of stuff in certain areas, but then kind of like food deserts or food apartheid, there's kind of like this knowledge, and in particular in urban spaces, is very few and far between. I mean, there's probably more folks doing this stuff in Asheville than like, Charlotte, Atlanta, and a bunch of other big cities in the Southeast combined. Yeah, we definitely need to ramp it up given the challenges that we're going to face moving forward. That's for sure.
With the Appalachian Herb Collective, I've seen a lot of young plant enthusiasts come out.
That's true.
And that has been really, really, really cool. I think they have plans to expand at some point, and hopefully maybe the collective will grow enough where like we can expand out of the area and into some of these pockets.
Always thought with that is that Asheville, whether it's this herbal collective, whether it's our food system, whether it's how we take care of our nature, like that we're trying to create this model, right, that can be exported to ideally every community USA. Part of it here is that we have a bunch of schools that teach people about it, right? Yeah. And then we're in one of the most amazing places to live in the world. So the people that come to the schools, even if they're not from here, stay often. But it's so few and far between, especially as you go further west or further south. As far as this stuff goes, although every state has at least some cadre of this, but often like what we have just in Asheville, it would take the whole state to come together, and it might not be as big a collective as what we have in our little tiny town of 100,000 people and 250,000 in the metro district.
Yeah, every time I've lived outside of Asheville, I've really have noticed that.
Yeah,
where like it's just like
it drops off.
Where are the herb people? Where's an acupuncturist I could go to? Yeah, it definitely does.
Well, that kind of helps segue into the next question for any listeners whose wheels might be turning in terms of like, yeah, I want to get out there and contribute. How do I do this? Like, what is your idea of like who an herbalist or ethnobiologist is and what one does with that role? Like, what does that serve in our day and age that it might, inspire others to walk similar path?
I just want to give one other person their flowers before I move on to that, and that's Subhande Greer. She runs the Natural Choices Botanica website and also has these amazing Afrobotany retreats in Tennessee and further afield in other countries. In particular, has done that in Costa Rica. And that's a huge thing for me that can also be tough in this format is, in particular, say I'm half Black and I'm half white, so I just am constantly trying to bridge realms. And at the same time, like Afrobotany could be its own podcast too, right? But I definitely have to just at least represent for Subhande among numerous other African American people and other folks that have been real big influences. But I'd say her and also a lady named Rachel Thomas that brought me in as a speaker at my first Afrobotany conference years ago in Costa Rica.
Nice.
Have been really profound in influencing my path. But as far as like what an ethnobiologist is, I mean, I think I want to just make it as broad as it could possibly be. It's somebody who studies the human connection to other life forms. And sometimes it can feel kind of ivory tower-ish and locked up in academia, but it's not like you have to have a degree to be an ethnobiologist. I would submit that some of the best ethnobiologists in the world are probably indigenous people that are living in the traditional ways of their group that has been ongoing for thousands of years. And that's a huge shift, actually, in the science realm, in academia as well, of basically having somebody from, one of the rich places in the world parachute into one of the poor places often that's real exotic, and then like kind of describe for the world what these people are doing with their associated life forms. Not to denigrate that work in total, because in one way it's all we have from like way back in the day, but also it's very problematic. I'll just keep it at that there are going to be blind spots. I mean, just even language, let alone worldview and all these things that an outsider, especially if you're coming in for your 2-year master's or your 4-year PhD, it's like, how much are you going to get? So really having an ethnobiologist that is raised within that culture, goes away to school and learns the techniques of the science of it, and then can come back and describe that group for themselves, and maybe not also publish it for the outside world. Maybe they don't want that, and often they don't want the outside world anymore necessarily to know all of their ways of being, especially with plant medicines and these kinds of things. Although, of course, if you're coming from within a group, you're going to also have your own blind spots too. So it's not necessarily, to say that one is totally better than the other. But if you probably had to choose between the two, having somebody from within the group with the skills to describe their traditions is going to be more holistic and comprehensive than having somebody who is just, passing through from the outside world.
If you're from the culture, you're the best person to speak for the culture instead of someone from outside.
To some degree, but to not like also make it monolithic. Like the Cherokee is a great example. Our local indigenous people, I appreciate just being able to qualify it, because sometimes, it doesn't get said. And then like I kind of think back, but basically we have the Eastern Band that is in the Asheville area, and then you have most of them out in Oklahoma. And there's very different experiences at this point, since the Trail of Tears in the 1830s that has led to almost this like evolution, of those groups in separation from each other. Not that, of course, there's not a whole lot overlap, but that's just one group, let alone if you have a whole bunch of different groups in a certain area. Nonetheless, somebody from within that group, in general is going to often be better than somebody that's totally from outside the group.
I was just thinking, and maybe this is kind of a very rough, broad idea, but if you had, people from each group and they came together and they spoke about their group, then you'd have a better picture of, I guess, humanity, human experience on this planet in regards to how we relate to nature and, the animals and our environment and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the more voices, the better, right? Because you could have a vision from the male, part of the group, a vision from the female part of the group, a vision from the two-spirit or, non-binary part of the group. So there's that too. You have the young people, the old people, the higher class people, the lower, So yeah, the more voices to kind of, once again, make that holistic. And of course, somebody from within the group is going to have a sense of those cultural norms also more readily, than somebody coming from some city and big university that grew up in the suburbs. Yeah, so the more the better. But of course, this stuff is painstaking. It's slow. It's expensive. So there are so many groups that, even just in our state, the Cherokee are one that people pretty much know all over the world, but the Lumbee, the Hallowasaponi, there was 8 different groups just for North Carolina alone. Oftentimes people paint indigenous folks with some broad brush and just the Indians did this and the Indians did that, right? But like there are so many diverse voices, obviously, from within any one, little unit of a group, let alone across something like North Carolina, let alone North America in that regard.
Kind of going back to your mention of, wouldn't it be ideal if there were sort of these guilds of people who knew and passed on this information? You have the ivory tower approach where, maybe somebody immerses themselves for a brief time in their studies, but then they go back to just teach it in an academic format. It doesn't necessarily get applied. And then you've got the indigenous folks, especially in more remote regions of the world, they just live it every day. It's what they know, it's what they do, it's who they are. And then I think you have so many of us here in the in-between where it's like we see that there's more to it practically than just keeping it in books in institutions, but we're definitely not all, going to go. We either don't have indigenous roots as close to the surface in our lineage anymore, or we're so far removed in a cultural surroundings to live that way. That's where the guild comes in. So it's like if you're speaking to somebody who was like, well, yeah, but like, why would you, what's the point of being an herbalist or an ethnobiologist in the 21st century if you're, just coming at it from not the institution and not the tribe? What's the answer? Like, what would your answer be there? Because clearly you're living, like you're finding a way to apply it. So if you could speak to that, like that's not a hard one or anything.
Yeah, it is. It's hard in that just as somebody who studied sustainability for decades, it's really challenging the arc of where I see us headed. And as somebody who's also almost 50 years old and kind of grew up in a different world, really, like pre-internet, pre-cell phones, all that stuff, which we could easily go back to for a number of different reasons. If nothing else, there's like literally just the pure primal motivating force of survival, of your local group. And obviously, that's not to say, maybe everybody certainly doesn't need to be a specialist in this stuff, even at that kind of more tribal group level. But I will say in a lot of indigenous groups, most everybody does know the top 10 or so awesome wild edible plants and, anything that can hurt them to avoid so that they don't get those mixed up. And then the top 10 or so medicinal plants that are for just common conditions that we all have. Yeah, I guess there is certain pragmatic aspects of like just straight pure survival, but to be honest, there's so much to be gained in this pursuit, whether as a specialist or just in a kind of more layperson way in the psychospiritual emotional realm, right? Of like connecting with the other aspects of nature, understanding how much we and our success is dependent upon them, reclaiming the means of production that have so often gotten outsourced to some unknown and unseen quantity that often is masking a horrific type of process in the background. So there's a lot of those kinds of ways of like empowering yourself, saving money, saving carbon, and localizing the sources of these things versus outsourcing them to thousands of miles away, that really are important as well, I would say. And then lastly, just from an energetic standpoint, basically anywhere I go in the world at this point that's cold, I'm going to see friends. I'm going to feel held, by the world of plants, because there are these certain plants that grow everywhere. That's a little bit harder to communicate as far as the sense that you get from just being surrounded by familiarity, even in places that you've never been.
My parents, a couple years ago, moved to Texas. They followed my brother and then he had a child, so they wanted to be grandparents, so they moved. But I was so excited because, I found chickweed growing in Texas and I didn't think it would grow. And I was like, oh, wow, there's chickweed.
Old
friend, right.
Hello, chickweed, my old friend.
So I was really like, every time I'm in a new place, I'm always looking for the plants. I'm like, what plants are here? And I found chickweed and cleavers and rosemary, and I too understand what you're saying.
Yeah, it's super fun to do that.
My youngest sister was also at Warren Wilson for a time before she switched over to UNCA, and she had botany studies in her undergrad, but she took a job out in California and has been out there for a while now, but she didn't really feel settled in there or kind of more at home there until she became familiar with all of the plants there, because it was so different than our biome here in Southern Appalachia, where it was just like she was a fish out of water and it was like an awkward thing to her. But then once she became comfortable with the plants out there, she's like, oh yeah, I could stay here. It's like how to tell if you're a plant nerd.
Yeah, and I think a term that also goes along with that is sense of place.
Yeah.
To have a comfortable sense of place with what's around you.
So what is your favorite aspect of working with nature and your areas of expertise?
Yeah, that one felt a little bit easier. I mean, definitely being in the field with live, organisms, and in particular plants, and specifically in places of incredible diversity like botanical gardens, and also just really, unusual habitats where you see special plants. And then doing plant walks as far as teaching goes, being in the field with people where you can use all of your senses and just have this kind of IRL, as they say now, in real life interaction.
Yeah, I think that component gets a little lost somewhat in our current times. Speaking to what I was sort of previously with the explosion of interest on things like Instagram and TikTok and everywhere else, it's like that's great to whet the palate and have a jump off, or for your studies in the winter when everything's dormant to some extent, or whatever the case may be. But like, there's still never going to be a pure substitute for just getting out there and actually getting to touch it and feel it and smell it and taste it and all that. So
yeah, literally embody it. And certainly they have their place, but I think it'll always be supplemental to a certain degree from the like direct in-person experience.
What's the hardest thing you feel you've experienced in your role as an ethnobiologist?
There's two things that came pretty quickly. One is making a good living. And then the other one is even more profoundly challenging, and seeing the devastation and loss happening in the world right now. and just being so keen, in your observational skills to just really feel it like some open wound across the planet. So I would say making a good living. I'm thinking making money, like making comfortable amount of money. I mean, I make an amazing living, actually, as far as quality of life, doing what I want, beautiful places. It's my calling, it's my passion. I mean, so few people, I feel like, really get to fully like do what they feel like is their calling, and their greatest passion in the world is their work, but it definitely doesn't currently pay really well, at least not the way I'm doing it. And I don't really know too many other people other than maybe social media influencers, actually, that would be getting paid really well doing it either.
Right, because it's like it just goes to show the lack of full understanding and appreciation and the importance of those roles and that knowledge, that we are in a society that can't let someone have a living off of that in that way, like that it's just not very heard of or practical. To your second part of your answer, I would have been surprised if, you hadn't said something to that extent, but at the same time, I think it's good to, for the audience at large and the audience we wish we had and everybody in between, that you say that, because it's like, oh, you might, someone might expect it from Al Gore, or, like someone would expect it from someone in a huge sphere to, make comment to that one way or the other. But for you who does do so much field work and has traveled so many places to see those impacts and be able to say, yeah, no, it's an open wound kind of everywhere going on. Let me reinforce that point that all of these other people have been making. Like I think that, fingers crossed, hopefully helps hammer that home. So that more people wake up to, that it is happening, and then maybe feel motivated to find their little piece of how they can help.
Yeah, that's the key. That is the key, is everybody to find their voice in the choir of, ending this ecological crisis that we're currently under.
I'm trying to think about how to ask this question, but I'll just ask it, and it has to do with what we were talking about. It's not on the list, but what do you think that, given the situation with climate change and everything else, would be some ways that people might be able to help the situation, either plant, people who are interested in doing more helping with plants, or just maybe in general, something like that.
Okay. Yeah, well, I would definitely lead with the rewords, the reduce, recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle, restore, reduce, reuse, restore, recycle. Like so often people are like recycling, is like the thing. And hopefully a lot of people are becoming aware that even if you put it in that blue bin, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's ending up in the next milk jug. Most, especially plastic, gets thrown away. Just refusing, actually, I think that's the first reword, is refuse, the plastic bag or the extra whatever kind of container and these kinds of things. But then in that way, reducing your load, all those, kinds of things. But yeah, as far as the plants specifically or other life forms, it comes down to conservation. And I'm glad you asked this off-script question, because I didn't really have United Plant Savers on here to really flesh out further beyond, my bio and stuff. And I feel like they're one of the greatest groups, and specific to medicinal plants, that is looking to conserve them. And in particular, using this concept of conservation through cultivation. Right, because most medicinal plants all over the world are still wild harvested. And that's a big issue for future sustainability, and especially with climate change and all the other threats those plants face. Growing these plants, especially if you use them, is a huge thing, or supporting other people that grow them. And another reword would be those people being local, relocalizing everything, whether it's where you're getting your plant medicine or where you're getting your local botany information, or yeah, where you're getting your food obviously from, at the farmer's market or through a CSA, or but just not outsourcing so much of everything to, these unseen, unknown entities, which often, once again, are masking tragedies as well that allow this crisis to go on. So, like, just having those means of production back in your hands, in the hands of your community, and in front of your face and in front of your ethics on what you want to see be happening for that food to get to your table, or that medicine to get into that bottle, or whatever it might be.
I think I spend a lot of time in my day like thinking about these issues because I work in capitalism. I am.
Well, and it's an existential threat that we're facing. I'm pretty clear at this point after obsessing on the subject too for decades. So it's important to think about. Unfortunately, a lot of people turn away from it though too. So good on you and good on us for addressing the elephant in the room, because it's definitely not going to go away unless we do something to engage with it.
And it is important to reiterate all those, like you said, the rewords, because I think sometimes people are like, well, there must be just some big, grand, magic thing me or someone has to do that'll be the thing that, and it's like, no, it's all these little conscious steps at an individual level that can only ripple out if enough individuals are adhering to it, so to speak, participating at that level.
I know, the corporations, if they chose to put their weight behind some of these things, they could really move the needle for us. And sometimes it feels like, I'm doing this and it's just a drop in the bucket, but I don't think they're going to do the right thing, unfortunately. So that leaves us as individuals to pull together and find a solution and make a difference.
I mean, it's an interesting supposition because, of course, one word, corporation, includes a lot of things. But
I'll
just give an example. Like Patagonia, the company that does all the outwear stuff, they have probably preserved more land in South America than any other entity other than maybe a government, just from their profits and their foundation. And so I do feel like you do occasionally find folks that have it within, of course, an outdoor supply company. It kind of makes sense. They love nature. They're out there hiking. They want to support it. But I think there are other corporations out there that, basically have that triple bottom line, right? Because every corporation, definitely the number one thing, the number one P is profit, right? But there are a lot of other corporations that are like the people on the planet too. I think coming from two very different cultures and bridging that inside myself makes me kind of like try to avoid dichotomies, because I do have hope that corporate space, in particular, because they have most of the resources, could, given a certain shift to their ethics and their priorities and making a living versus making a killing, I think would be a way to frame that. Yeah, you can still make profit and do tons of good stuff too, versus like, we're just going to maximize profit at any cost to whatever other things that might, be collaterally damaged by our practices, I
guess to be less broad and more specific on what I'm trying to express is that there needs to be more of those companies.
And this is the other piece. This is where I really don't like the word term consumer, but say like the person that's buying things, vote with your dollars. Vote for, those companies that are making those choices, and do your due diligence to know the difference, because ultimately businesses are going to serve what sells. What sells is more sustainability and less ecological damage and less exploitation of labor and all those things, then that's what they're going to do. But as long as we're buying fast fashion and stuff that's damaging the soil or whatever it might be that has this bad backstory, then that's what they're going to sell. So we do have that choice to play in the market, as it were, to drive that agenda, but we have to really organize. Like
in buying chocolate, we're like, oh, we know some of the chocolate companies are better than others, let's say, but it's like well, that's a big example. It's like, well, which one?
Well, it is a
So,
big example, and I'm going to go in just
oh,
on
you're
that
going,
because,
okay.
like, I have a huge
Just
thing.
like education in that, I feel like is definitely lacking.
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to
So
expand it though. I'll say chocolate, sugar, bananas. Those would be, and coffee, I guess, would be the four main ones that you can pretty readily often get fair trade organic. And I know people will, one of the immediate pushbacks often will be, well, but that's so much more expensive. And my point with it is none of that stuff is necessary. All of that stuff is privileged goods.
Mhm.
And traditionally, not even 50 years ago, every single one of those things, maybe other than, say, coffee, would have been like a treat, like a special treat that you got for special times. And I would much rather eat a smaller quantity of higher quality stuff that's not based off of, like, I mean, in the case of something like chocolate, there are literally little black children in Africa to this day in slave-like conditions harvesting chocolate for the big commercial companies. Then you like freaking connect that with when we do eat chocolate on the most special occasions, that you have something based on that kind of subjugation and tragedy that you're going to bring into your most special traditions, like Valentine's celebrating love, or Easter celebrating religion, or spring, or Halloween, for the kids. That these kids' joy in a rich place is based off of these kids' total horror in another place. These are the challenges I'm talking about. Of course, we can't grow chocolate either. I feel very strongly that if you are going to be consuming those things, that much as possible that they would be from the best sources possible. If not, then skip it, or consume less or something.
Definitely.
I like to think about how I have this old antique Hoosier cabinet that still has some old cardboard paper insert tacked on the inside of it that had like a meal planning suggestion, for the early 1900s housewife, and why certain vegetables were known to be important for your health because of vitamins that had just recently been identified in them. People were like skeptical about that when that first came.
Sure.
And it's so minimalist. It's so minimalist. It would have been a big deal to, have a good harvest of carrots that were like sweet enough to consider your treat because a candy didn't even exist for however many miles around you. That wasn't that long ago. It's like, think about that sort of image and have that in perspective of, one, just how privileged they are that they could, go a block away and get a plethora of chocolate. But two, really, really question that. Yeah, but how did we go from this to this so rapidly? There's no way that didn't happen without some problems in the system of how that occurred. And ultimately, how much do you need it?
And there's also no reason why we can't go from this back to that very rapidly too. Is part of the issue that people need to understand. Chocolate is super under threat. Coffee is super under threat. Bananas, super under threat. 3 of the largest trade goods globally, period, as far as plants go. But through climate change, through diseases, all these types of things, like all of those are getting much more expensive because they're getting much harder to grow. So there's no guarantee that this escalator we've been riding from the 40s, into this day and age is just going to keep going up with that kind of ready, available type of unlimited amount of resource that you can find somebody's lifetime supply of chocolate in one quickie mart.
It's crazy. You go into any big box store and there's so much chocolate and it's so cheap. Yeah.
Especially, given the true hidden cost in particular.
I think it's one of those things where people just don't even stop to think about, like, that's a plant that came from a plant. It requires everything that a plant requires to even exist, and then some, because of the post-processing as an agricultural product. Like, that's definitely
very complicated process, actually.
Yeah, the disconnect, a very good example of the disconnect from human and nature you were mentioning earlier, for sure.
You're not taught that, this chocolate I'm buying, I didn't have no idea. It's just,
well, it's hidden. It's hidden for a reason. Because That doesn't sell very well, the
Right,
backstory
it
in that
doesn't.
regard, right? So.
Like I'm going to the grocery store, I'm feeling all sad, and that doesn't make you feel hungry and want to buy chocolate. It has the opposite effect. It's very complicated. Very complicated.
And that's something we need to lean into. I think oftentimes people run away from complexity because it's harder, to process. That's really where the rubber meets the road. And as I learned at Warren Wilson, one of my favorite professors ever, I'll call in Dr. John Brock, he shared this concept, the devil is in the details.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that complexity lies.
But it's also hard. Learning is hard. You have
Especially learning hard things.
And learning hard things
that
is
are
hard.
Like very sad or challenging.
Right, and you have to confront all of we were talking about, everyone lives in a little bubble and all the things that you don't know and all your blind spots and everything else. And you're like, oh, oops.
One of the biggest things you're learning too is empathy, right? For like stuff that is outside of your personal purview, to feel something for folks that you'll never meet, that you'll never know, you'll never see, but yet they're feeding you on the daily. And so to like connect those dots is much more abstract than if they were right down the road from you or something.
Yeah, because again, you said, I guess this is a hidden thing. They're hidden. They're in another country, or they're in another state, or they're just somewhere in a factory you can't see, and you don't know them, and you don't know what they're going through to make the product that you are eating, enjoying, consuming. I don't want to say consuming, but it's once you start unpacking it, it just sort of keeps going.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's descended from fairly recently enslaved folks, like literally my dad grew up with somebody who was born enslaved. And like, yeah, it's just incumbent upon me personally to keep it real with the fact that that was not there and then, that is still here and now, and it's still as evil as it has ever been and in need of ending as fast as possible.
I guess on that note, we'll go back to the list of questions, or...
Yeah, I know. It's like quite the arc there. I went way into the deep end of the pool, and now we're kind of coming up for air a little bit. And
it needs to be said. It always needs to be said.
Yeah, and you still need the yin to the yang too, right?
So tell us more about the various teaching opportunities you offer and participate in, and any other means by which you put your knowledge of the natural world to use.
Pretty straightforward, that one. I have this online botany class that I teach by donation that I inherited from Frank Cook. He did it for 9 years, and then when he passed in 2009, I took it on in 2010. And so that is hosted at that website, botanyeveryday.com. And then beyond that, I teach for something on the order of maybe 30 to 40 different entities over the course of any given year. So in particular, botanical gardens, arboretums, a lot of our local colleges and universities and festivals, and then a number of conferences all over the place. Traditionally, historically, I've posted all that stuff on my website, Botany Every Day, as well, under the events tab. I actually kind of got out of that. It's crazy for me to think it now that it was in the pandemic, which we're like 5 years on. How is that possible? It's been 5 years since the pandemic started. But when that happened, of course, I lost all my work overnight, and in particular, anything that was in person. Although I pretty much quickly regained a lot of work in this way, like virtually, particularly because I have a ton of PowerPoints that were really locked and loaded and ready to go. This year, I'm dedicating myself to putting up this stuff on Botany Every Day, everything that I'm doing. I mean, how it kind of works basically is that I almost never need to promote myself anymore, thankfully. And also promoting myself is one of my least favorite things to do. So I kind of moved away from it because normally my class is full of their own accord and I'm teaching for other people who take on the marketing and all that stuff. But nonetheless, one thing, even from a personal aspect, that I really miss is just an archive of everything that I've ever taught. I don't know if I'll be able to backdate across the hundreds of things I've taught over the last 5 years, but at least moving forward in the coming year, 2025, I'm going to have everything up there under the events tab of what I'm going to be doing.
Nice. You've already got it all lined up for the year and ready to go?
Not really, but I'm very, very busy through April. Yeah, normally how I do it, it's kind of this bifurcated split. Like by January, I tend to have the first half of the year kind of set. And then once I've done that, I kind of steadily start to add into like more August, September, October, November. Although there's certainly some things even in those months that are just standard, like conferences that I go to every year. Mm-hmm. Like the Sustainable Ag Conference that's here in North Carolina in November or something. But yeah, but there's still definitely some gaps to fill.
Did you ever think that you'd become a teacher, or what is your favorite thing about being a teacher?
You know, like I said, I was raised to be an officer in the military my whole upbringing. So I certainly, maybe not so much as a child, but pretty quickly after I got out of ROTC and was like searching for what's next, I feel like my first classes I started to teach, for instance, in 99 when I was 24. So still fairly early. I was kind of on that path, I would say. So impacting the future positively is my favorite thing about being the teacher, especially as someone who doesn't have my own biological kids that I'm raising or anything. I feel like that is, you know, kind of my greatest legacy is to, you know, inoculate the culture of the future with these principles.
Nice.
So what is your most favorite subject to teach about?
Yeah, botany in general, but I would say tree ID in particular. I've always had an affinity for trees practically since I can remember. And I've had a number of special trees in my life since I was very young, as I think a lot of people can resonate with. Outside of that, though, wild foods, fermentation, and the traditions of underrepresented folks would kind of round out some of my favorite things to teach.
So if people were interested in taking one of your classes, would they just go to Botany in a Day website right now? Would they be able to find? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, right now being when this comes out, because I guess I gather it'll be later February. Yeah, that stuff's not up there now, but we're talking, you know, at the end of December. And yeah, within the next few days, I'll have pretty much everything up through April at least. And then whatever else I know that's up beyond that.
Okay.
And awesome. As an extension of your teaching, we always like to ask our guests this: what are some of your favorite herb or plant books, or for that matter, any books pertaining to humans' relationship with the natural world that you're like, oh yes, you got to have that in your library?
Yeah, and this one was probably the hardest one that way, because I have many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plant books, but I did kind of distill it down, and Medicinal Herbalism by David Hoffman was kind of one of the foundational ones for me. Or Medical Herbalism, I think it might be, but David Hoffman's the author. Certainly Juliet, who I mentioned earlier, has her own book that's a master magnum opus, The Healing Garden. I think of Mimi Hernandez, who just came out with the National Geographic Herbal. Number of books by dear friend and inspiration, Becky Byer, especially for anybody that's feeling witchy and into like the folk aspects of, in particular, Appalachian herbalism. And then in Appalachia more generally, Patricia Critzy Howell with her book, The Medicinal Plants of Southern Appalachia. Phyllis D. Light, who's like at the extreme southern point where there's actually some of Appalachia in Alabama. And that's where she is. And she has a Southern folk medicinal book. And then pretty much anything by Rosemary Gladstar, without a doubt, very much incredible. And then I gotta kind of represent for other groups. As I said, I like to represent for underrepresented people, and certainly the indigenous folks of our area, in particular the Cherokee. A couple of books being Plants of the Cherokee by William Banks, which was his master's thesis from decades ago. And Cherokee Plants, A 400-Year History by Hamill and Chiltosky, which is an incredible resource. Both of those super affordable too. And then from the African-American angle, I would say African-American Herbalism, which is a pretty recent book by Lucretia Van Dyke. It's been a great inspiration. Working the Roots by Michelle Lee, and pretty much anything by Stephanie Rose Bird, who's written a whole bunch of books. And lastly, a real standout one in that almost every single African American herbalism book that I've come across is by a woman, but there is one, is the tradition of a man named Mr. John Lee. It's called Folk Wisdom and Mother Wit, and it was written with an academic named Marvilla Payne Jackson, and really does a great deep dive into some of the Carolina traditions of African Americans from like a really old head perspective. Although that one's really hard to come by, I would say. Very expensive if you do. But
awesome. We've had Patricia and Becky on the podcast as well. So I'll leave those links too if anyone wants to check out those interviews. And I'll leave the whole list of books with links if I can find them.
One thing I would just say also is on my website, Botany Every Day, under the references tab, I have huge suggested reading lists on wild edibles, on fermentation, on medicinal plants, on poisonous plants, on indigenous plants, just so anybody knows. And you can download those as PDFs. They're basically like a bibliography style, sometimes hundreds of references per subject.
We should just start linking that.
Oh, yeah.
In every podcast we do. Just, and by the way, further reading. Go to this.
We should. We should.
Yeah, bring it on. We need to do that cross. That's how it works out there with the algorithm. Is the more there's that kind of cross linking, the more it's valued, basically. So.
That's what I have found out in trying to learn some
SEO.
SEO. I was like, oh.
Yeah. Search engine optimization for folks not familiar with that acronym, SEO. But definitely not what I want to do as a botanist, I'll tell you that.
You want to be sort of probably out there working with plants, less time on the computer maybe, but
not even maybe.
Definitely.
I mean, it's interesting that way, right? Yeah, and it's ironic in the venue that we're currently in, which I totally honor, and at the same time, it's just like anything, the difference is the dosage, and this realm can suck you in so much, and it's like engineered to do so, that I feel like I'm in this active motion of, rather than ramping up my screen time as time goes on, has clearly been the trend the last couple of decades. I feel like I'm at peak screen time now, and like I'm actually going to go down in my amount of screen time with the limited little bit of life that I have left at this point. So yeah, that's my take on that. But give thanks for the amazingness of it too. It's like anything, it's a double-edged sword. It can cut for good and it can cut for bad, just how you use it.
Yeah, it's a great communication tool, but also it can be all those other things that,
especially a time suck that's like really hard to avoid. So, it just whoosh.
I'm gonna mention real fast was like during the hurricane when we lost, internet, we lost cell phone. I've never lost those before. Like we lost internet, but cell phone is just and the weather was still so nice that we took walks every evening, and we're fortunate to live in a neighborhood where you could walk and there's a bunch of houses, and we had these long chats with all of our neighbors who were like on their porches because you couldn't watch TV. I mean, you could, but you just have to watch movies that you maybe had or didn't have. Like we don't have very many actual physical movies. So it was really, really great. And I was so sad when it came back because we were walking by and they weren't out anymore. I was like, oh, they're just probably watching TV or doing something else. And and it was just amazing. And you felt like you had more time. Like I wasn't working, but I think we would still be going on walks if I'd been working, because we did do that a lot. But it just felt like there was, what are you doing? Oh, I don't know. We're just hanging out. And it was really cool. And I feel like it just, for some reason, when you have the internet, when you have cell phone, when you have all these things, it feels like there's less time. And I don't.
Yeah, they're distractions. Their time sucks, and And in particular, it's that stuff that just pulls you in that you weren't expecting, and you come out on the other side half an hour later, and you're like, "What just happened to me?" You know. And I will say, I really missed this particular because we went through such incredible tragedy. That kind of connectivity was definitely hard. I felt like I guess I'll just say, for lack of a better word, addiction to that level of connection, and in particular also being unexpected, although I subjugate myself to that all the time in my travels and camping and love it, to just be totally off the grid and, just with nature. And
it's different when you're doing it by choice.
Exactly.
Having it ripped out from under you with the big unknown. Yeah.
I think we didn't specifically mention community, but maybe we did. But in talking about community, it's amazing. It's like you feel connected, but yet disconnected in the way that the world is right now. But when hurricane happened and we were disconnected from the internet and power and all these things, and then we found ways of actually still connecting and getting information to people and sharing information. Like Firestorm had Firestorm is a bookstore in West Asheville, and they had daily community meetings, and they had like spontaneous message boards. Sometimes I think about when you're talking about like chocolate and how we could easily go back to having, less chocolate in our lives. Sometimes I think about our ways of communicating or interacting with people, or we could easily go back to a pre-internet way of communicating or a different way of communicating. It's like it wasn't lost. I felt like we knew what to do.
I'd like to hope so, but I do wonder how generationally that is. I think folks like our age, and certainly older, we have a context for it a little bit. But especially younger people that have just grown up with the internet and the smartphone in particular as just the air they breathe and the water they swim in. I do wonder, how that level of disconnection could be super disruptive. And, I kind of think of like voluntary simplicity in that regard, even if it's, once a week, once a year, where you're just kind of like, some people do digital fasts, on Sunday, kind of like in that tradition of the Sabbath or something. But I've willingly put myself in situations where I have no internet, no electricity, like the Rainbow Gathering, for instance, would be an example where you typically don't have any of that stuff, maybe for weeks on end. So I was very practiced, for decades, and it was still really hard to be hauling all the water to flush the toilets and to like be listening to the AM radio to try to get the updates at the same time as everything else. And
well, I guess it wouldn't be necessarily easy, but I took heart in the fact that people sort of knew what to do or devised.
Yeah, it was like a gear that we just shifted this gear into our community, where it's like, well, now we're in the community gear and politics don't matter and class doesn't matter. And, color, whatever. I mean, probably over idealizing now, to be honest. But regardless, there was just this great, amazing coming together across normal divides that would be there for the common good. And that is very heartening. And at the same time, I feel like that's a bit of a core value and also something that Appalachia as a region is not very far removed from. That's integral to any indigenous community. But say then you go to a big city, where people have just grown up with like, just order whatever you want, either over the phone or over the internet. And you don't even know your neighbors, let alone your providers of your basic goods. Kind of thing. That's, I think, a much harder lift for folks in those environments. And also in places, because I grew up in a big city in South Florida where you're just straight scared in normal conditions of like what can happen to you in bad ways. Then when the S hits the fan, like I would never want to be in any big city for any big disaster that way. I mean, it will pull people together, but there's going to be a lot more people falling through as well, unfortunately, in those kind of situations, given the scale. Yeah, that just kind of way that people have been removed from that power of community that we just kind of have here, even in normal circumstances to some degree. It's not very beneath the surface, to come together for lots of other reasons besides just disasters and things.
Given that a lot of your work and home base is here in Western North Carolina and the Southern Appalachian Mountains, we just saw the record-breaking ecological devastation from Hurricane Helene in September of this year, from which there's still recovery going on and will be for a long time. How has that impacted your life, your work, and really, I'm curious, the knowledge of the ecosystems around us, because I haven't heard as much about that side of things, about like what are we talking in terms of impact,
That's a big multi-part question, so I'm going to try to make sure I get to the different aspects. Me personally, my house was flooded. I'm nowhere near any water under normal circumstances, but with the level of rain that we got, as you said, that was historic in some cases, at least back a century, to the Swannanoa River, which is the area where I live by, the record goes back to the 1700s since we've seen anything like this. And so water just starts pouring out of the hill at that level of rain and into the back of our house. Well, actually, this was the crazy thing. The storm Helene came on Friday, but my sweetie called me, and I was up teaching in Boone, a couple hours north from where I live, on Thursday morning, and the house was already flooded in the bedroom, right before the hurricane even came, right?
Because we got a bunch of rain.
Because we had another storm that brought kind of a record amount of rain already before the hurricane even got there. Then it was just kind of all hands on deck, this crazy stressful day of trying to like suck out water with sump pumps and bail water. But basically anything that was on the floor when she woke up Thursday morning, especially bookwise, for instance, or other, susceptible things in boxes or whatever, got ruined. And I probably lost about $500 of books in that process. We were trying to just contain it to the bedroom. I got another sump pump. I came down from Boone. We're trying to suck the water out. Then the power goes out. So then show's over. You can't move the water anymore. It's clear the house is going to flood. So then it's just like a waiting game and a prayer that like a tree doesn't come down in the house, which would be the next level of craziness. And that you're in a certain special circumstance when your house gets flooded and you feel lucky. But I literally do. I mean, I kind of was, you make deals in certain, I was just like, just don't bring the trees down. We'll call it even, and like we don't get a tree through the roof like that, because there are these huge white pines right by them. Those were some of the most susceptible trees to coming down. We had, just on this little road I live on, 9 trees across the road, just there.
Wow.
But to your point, Jennifer, the neighbors, not like any public official authority, had that road cleared within a day. I mean, they were like country people can survive great, had their traco, had their chainsaws,
Wow.
and I'm still to this day, I'm actually down in Florida right now because that's where I grew up with my family for the holidays, but I'm headed back on the 1st of January to continue forth this rehabbing of the house. Basically, I had to do a whole bunch of work in the bedroom, but also in the bathroom and the kitchen, and luckily that's kind of over the hump. So basically simultaneously to basically inheriting hundreds of hours, countless hours, nonstop hours since September 27th of unexpected work, then I also kind of like the pandemic lost a bunch, thousands of dollars worth of work overnight, because anything in person, I'd be teaching at the Botanical Gardens, I'd be teaching at, very Woodson Branch Nature School and all these other places that over that next month and a half, the Leaf Festival, it all got canceled, right? Now, luckily, some very dear friends and supporters from our local community and beyond have stepped up to really help offset some of that for me. So I'm super grateful. And once again, ultimately feel lucky, even though I've worked countless hours for months on end unexpectedly in that regard. As far as like how that's affected the space, there's multiple layers. For one, just the water courses have changed. Water courses do when you have these extreme events. So rivers aren't where they used to be. And but that at the same time where the river came up to dumped a whole bunch of extra silt or whatever on top of, in particular, a lot of our farm fields, right? Because the best farmland is by the river. A natural thing to think about in that regard too is what kind of pollution might be happening in that regard. And I am happy to say that there's been a lot of testing already. And for the most part, that testing has been coming back with really promising results. So I think it can be easy to get really freaked out. I'm at a loss for words of what you might think about, and myself included, when I went to see where there's anything that could have been in anybody's house now just like down there right on the riverbank, and I don't have to just, enumerate all the different random chemicals that a lot of people have. I guess, yeah, I mean, one of the classic sayings, which I kind of like learned decades ago and take some, I don't know, exception to, but it's dilution is the solution to pollution. It's literally like an official historic take on it, but it seems to kind of be playing out. And also that there's ways of binding pollution too, like that organic matter can often glom onto some of that and won't let it just be free floating out there in the environment too. But I guess that's a whole other podcast. I just did a whole class at the Botanical Gardens for hours on the science of phytoremediation, which is using plants to clean up damage in the environment. Wow. Yeah, I'll certainly be teaching that class a number of times next year too, because it is such a big concern. I mean, there's definitely, just say the Arboretum, which is a few hundred acres, had many thousands of trees down, so collectively hundreds of thousands of trees, if not millions. And so that's going to really open up the canopy. There's going to be a lot more sun. Unfortunately, with disturbance in sun often comes a lot more of exotic invasives. And I'm going to reel myself in because I said, I mean, there is an unfortunate aspect to that. There's no doubt. But I think this is a whole nother podcast, but exotic invasives are also often totally demonized. And at the same time, a lot of exotic invasives have potential applications. So something that, for food, for medicine, for all sorts of crafts and all sorts of things. I think there's this challenge to maybe get that knowledge out there more so that like we can kind of basically turn a problem into a potential solution, justify the energy and time and effort it takes to remove them. Well, if we're going to do that, can we then use that for something?
Yeah. Well, especially because of climate change, and it's like there's a big a green flag, so to speak, pointing like, okay, well, but look what's still surviving here. Look what came in and took place. Like, hello, what's this? If that's what's going to make it through these crazy times, then maybe we ought to look at that and see how that might be helpful. Yeah.
Very much so. Exactly. What are the resilient ones that are going to be there for free, basically, versus how much energy we put into cultivating things, let alone bringing them in from far afield. These things are just offering themselves up without any effort other than just go harvest. I think that is this kind of framing that I'm really on a mission to shift a bit in that regard. But another thing, though, nonetheless, so not to downplay the challenges, that that's going to then a lot of these not as fast and vigorous growing things, some of our most special native medicinals in particular, can be rapidly overgrown in their habitat. And a lot of them are already threatened, if not endangered, like ginseng to a certain degree. So levels upon levels. But then at the same time, one of the things I immediately thought of as somebody who studied mycology a lot is, wow, is that a whole bunch of mushroom food? And so whether it's like intentionally people chopping them down like Warren Wilson College is doing and various others and making shiitake mushrooms out of those oak logs or, oysters out of the wood chips or whatever, eventually those things are just going to come out of their own accord. Throughout our whole environment is going to be this explosion of chicken of the woods and hen of the woods and turkey tails and all of these super famous edibles and medicinals in that regard. So that's a bit of a silver lining, I would say, on that cloud of change and challenge.
What inspires you most about plants and or the natural world?
Oh, that's an easy one that came to me, which is the incredible diversity. There's just always more to learn and relearn for that matter the older you get. Yeah, so it's just limitless in such a good way. It's definitely very inspiring to me, as well as how much they help us in so many ways as well.
That's kind of a nice thought to reflect on too. If anybody's ever feeling, kind of alone, it's just like, yeah, but think about, like, if you think about the myriad of living things that in just the plant kingdom alone, just the diversity of everything is so far from alone.
What advice would you give both to any budding fellow plant nerds, herbalists, ecologists, permaculturists, and so forth?
I think what I would say as an overarching theme is just to get a whole bunch of different perspectives, especially early on in your journey on whatever the subject might be, and kind of synthesize for yourself your personal, take on it that works the best for your given circumstance. And in regards to that, one thing I would really put out there is a great way to do this is whether it's the Earth Skills gatherings or conferences where you kind of have this buffet, this smorgasbord of learning. I think of the Medicines from the Earth conference that happens in our area traditionally in Black Mountain at the Blue Ridge Assembly, although that place was really messed up by Helene, so we'll see. But people come from all over the country to teach at that. At the same time, that conference and a lot of conferences and even some of the Earth Skills can be pretty expensive. So one of the biggest advices I would give is my experience when I was a poor young person was almost any happening that's going on, if you contact them months ahead and say, I don't have money, but I really need this information and I'm happy to help in any way I can, then you can often certainly get some kind of work trade, if not even some work trade scholarship or just scholarship type of aspect, be able to participate in that educational opportunity. So don't basically let the sticker price, keep you from pursuing those types of experiences. Because I think I've seen that happen with a lot of folks when they just look at, $300, $500 or something for the weekend. I just don't have that, which of course, that's also a generational thing. I mean, unless you come from money, not a lot of young people in this field are going to have that. But yet, if we want this to continue into the future, we need to have young people in those spaces. Mm-hmm. And to our point that we were talking about quite a while ago now, I'm not seeing nearly enough young people in those spaces for what we need to be doing moving ahead.
So two things. The Asheville Herb Fest is free and they are having classes.
Yeah, amazing opportunity for anybody in our area. And that's in end of April, I think, this year.
End of April, yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing is, do you have any thoughts on how to maybe bring in more young people into the space?
Well, I think what you're doing, I think a big part of this is meeting people where they're at. And most young people are online. That's certainly part of it. I feel like there's something else out there that's wanting to bubble to the surface as far as how to make that available. But I think especially just not having money be a barrier to participation, I guess, would be an overarching thing, to have that be just more universal. And I guess I'm surprised I didn't call Frank Cook's concept in with this regard, because he lived his life by donation, and he basically had the saying, give what you can and receive what you need. Yeah, just really removing that kind of like barrier, I think is going to be an essential thing for young folks. And also kind of like, I think to your point, Jennifer, that kind of been touching on of like, I don't know if I kind of envisioned some cookie crumb trail or something, but something that gets people out of the screen and into IRL, into the woods, and embodying this stuff, not just, liking it and hearting it and smiley facing it and all of the kind of emojis, but to actually be making wild food meals and making their own sauerkraut and making their own teas and tinctures and oxymels. And yeah, I think something that kind of like activates this energy to want to really do this stuff and like have it as a way of life instead of just like one of the things on your feed, like a call to action.
Yeah, some sort of meetup type thing, but
that would be cool too. You know, like when I was coming up, when I was a young person in my 20s, and maybe this still happens, but I don't feel like it's in my scope, and maybe it's now that I'm in almost 50, but potlucks, you know, like I went to so many potlucks, and that's what turned me into a vegetarian. That's what turned me on to Juliet and herbalism, just as much as the other stuff I was talking about with Vipassana and Phoenix Rising was these potlucks that happen all the time, where people would bring awesome food and share great knowledge and music and fellowship. And I gather, at least in my space, it's not happening as much. Maybe for other scenes it is, but yeah.
I have not seen that. I remember, because I grew up in the 80s, so, you know, I remember my parents, you know, that was a thing, definitely. Yeah. You know, bring the Tupperware.
Yeah.
Right? Like, yeah.
Trade recipes, compare notes, you know, share the surplus.
Well, maybe something will emerge.
I think so. A lot of times, you know, unfortunately, this stuff doesn't happen proactively. It emerges when it's needed. You know, and I totally get that. I mean, I wish people would be a little more proactive, given the hill we have to climb moving forward into the future. But I get if there's not some very strong motivating force pushing it into place, then yeah, if you don't have to, then you're not going to, you know, oftentimes. I just worry like about, you know, I really want to build that gear shift in for folks though, you know, so that when it's needed, just like our community did, that at least they have that gear available, you know, to like shift into.
If nothing else, reduce the stress, the transition, if you're a little bit more mentally prepared.
Yeah. And also like combine forces in your different skill sets and abilities and that kind of thing. Because nobody is an island, right? As the saying goes. We can be islands now, right? Artificially through this structure of our society that's currently prevailing, and don't have to interact with one single person to get any need that you need at this point. You just press buttons and it's there. I feel like is a very short part of the human story moving forward, and we'll see.
Well, I know you talked a little bit about, you know, you're going to end up having all of your year's
classes
offerings on your website pretty soon, but I guess being that, you know, we're going to try to air this episode here in the next couple months, in the early part of 2025, can you at least maybe, for listeners' sake, share with the audience anything you're launching, an educational opportunity or something you're studying or a call to action you're working on that might be worth promoting here and sharing?
Yeah, so for sure, easiest thing, once again, by donation, is the class that's online at Botany Every Day. It starts right around the spring equinox, the 3rd of March. So that will be one of the things coming up. But then beyond that, to be honest, I really want to start putting out books. I have a number of different ideas. Yeah, although I've wanted to do this for a very long time, probably well over a decade. I feel like this has got to be the year to start that process. I think I'm just going to self-publish initially and kind of just get some of my ideas out there. And ultimately, another long held dream that I really want to bring to fruition sooner than later is to have my own school as well.
Nice.
Yeah. So watch this space. You know, I'll be talking about more of that as time goes on further into the year at Botany Every Day.
Nice.
And we'd love to read any book that you have that you come out with, and we can definitely bring you back to talk about it. We can
Awesome.
we love books, so
nice.
Ooh,
that's another big one. That's kind of like a dying art form, you know, that I feel like maybe to our detriment. Once again, when the internet's cut off, it's kind of nice maybe to have some books as a backup.
Definitely. Although I was really worried that we would lose them faster than it seems like we are.
Me too.
I'm just hoping that we will never actually really completely.
I don't think so. I think there'll always be kind of like a subset of society. How big it is, not really sure, but I think there'll always be a hardcore subset of book lovers. And yeah, very hardened, especially local bookstores. They were like, oh, with Barnes and Noble, those are out. With Amazon, those are out. Who's out? Barnes and Noble's out. But Malprops, our local bookstore, Firestorm you mentioned, and hundreds of others all over the country are flourishing. I do have hope for that. Although, yeah, I wish there were still more book lovers out there. Whenever I teach a class in person, I always bring like 10, 15, 20, 30 books on the subject. And it's always interesting and often underwhelming and humbling to me, like who actually engages with that material. I'm like, did I really just haul like 50 pounds of stuff like here just to have it kind of sit there? But even it does my heart good that one or two out of the 20, they're like, oh, taking pictures of all the titles. And like, okay, well, at least I'll hold it down for that subset till the day I die.
So right now, I really don't have a lot of time for reading, but if I get a book on Audible to listen to, I will still buy the hard copy. Because I'm like, I gotta have the hard copy. I can't just not have the book.
Interesting. Yeah. See, the thing I like about the hard copy is to be able to like highlight and scribble in the margins, and that's always going to be my number one go-to versus a screen or even auditorily. But there's certainly, especially for big long books, and especially like I think of Robin Wall Kimmerer, for instance, who has such an incredible voice as well, to listen to her as well as get the message she's trying to get across in like Braiding Sweetgrass or that new book about the serviceberry. Man, there is an incredible audio that was kind of like years ago about the serviceberry that I think kind of informed this new book that just came out from her. I'm trying to think of what it's like, some alternative press, but I think it is The Abundance of the Serviceberry. If you put in a search engine, it'd probably come up. And I'm sure there'll be an audible version of that more bigger book probably at some point too. It was from Emergence magazine. While we're waiting for the audible version of the full book to come out, they have a piece on the serviceberry that she did in 2022.
And Mark, I would assume with our talk here that your hope or your vision for your school would include an IRL piece to it, if not entirely.
Yeah, the idea is for it to be in person for like 15, 20 or so folks being, in the field, a combination of like PowerPoints basically, and then field time to apply the knowledge that's shared in that format. And I'm not sure, to be honest, about a more virtual aspect. I wrestle, to be honest, with virtual teaching, although it's certainly saved my bacon in the pandemic, and I think it's certainly better than nothing, and especially for people in isolated communities without in-person opportunities. But I mean, to me, the greatest time is in person with students in the field, and that's ultimately what I want to be doing more than anything, other than reading and like gardening and loving. Not necessarily in that order.
Oh, awesome. I'm totally looking forward to all that. Yeah,
thank
definitely.
you. Me too.
Do you have anything you wanted to add before we say goodbye?
Well, certainly, once again, just thank you so much for your work in this space and for pulling me into that work. And the collective time that we've shared here to do this deep dive has felt like a great gift and a privilege, really, to be able to share this perspective in this way. And Yeah, and that I hope to, as you were alluding to, just keep in touch, maybe interact more in this space, but certainly IRL
Definitely.
at the Herb Festival and various other places. Yeah, I'm just so grateful for the community that I have and we have and the roles that we collectively play within that.
Well, thank you. It's been great. Really great talking with you today.
Nice. Yeah, when we talked about, I'm not sure what the final form will be, but we're at a couple hours now. That does feel like, wow, but it flew by, to be honest, for me. Like, yeah, I just felt so present, which of course is one of the greatest gifts in life, to just be like fully present in the moment with some nice people that you're having a good time with. So thank you. That's its own great gift, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, when I started this, I was like, am I going to be able to do this thing? Because when you do an interview, you have the questions, right? But you don't really know where the interview is going to take you. So, um, but yeah, I was able to do it mostly
Here we are.
for the most part. I mean,
Here we are.
it was a little wobbly.
It's got a good flow.
There's always editing. But yeah,
Yeah, and it's nice to leave space for me, like that duality of structure and spontaneity, and to weave those together is that great, happy hybrid place, I would say.
All right, so thank you, Marc. Thank you so much for chatting with us today. Thank you, everyone out there, for listening. We really, really appreciate it. Yes, we will have Marc's links and all of the links of everything we talked about in the description if you want to go down all the rabbit holes. You can follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're on YouTube. We're on Instagram. We're on TikTok. And again, we'd like to invite our listeners to consider supporting us through a humble little donation. We have a Patreon page. And so if you don't have an extra $1, $10, or $5, please comment, please heart our posts, like us, follow us. That also really supports us. So we appreciate it. And anyway, we will see everybody next time. So bye.
Yeah.